Welcome back. Once again, this is Father Helms, priest in charge of St. Monica's Anglican Church. In this next series, we're going to be looking at God's eternality. Now, per usual, we're going to start this conversation by thinking about creatures first. You are watching this video at some point in time on a specific day, specific hour. And earlier in your day, you were doing something else, and presumably in the future, 20 minutes from now, an hour from now, 5 days from now, you're going to be doing something else. And as humans, we, of course, change. We account for this change by both before and after. You think about any type of time that we, whether it's seconds, days, or months, those are somewhat arbitrary. Of course, it's tied to our relationship to the sun and the Earth's rotation, things of that nature. But nothing stops us from creating something totally else. Makes sense, though, to stick with the rotation of the Earth and our relationship to the sun for our measurements of time. But they are measurements, and they are measurements of change related to before and after. But we've already established much earlier in this series, and we will develop this further when we get specifically to the topic of God's immutability, that because God is perfect, because he is pure act, he has no potentiality, that's going to mean that he doesn't change. So therefore, if God does not change, then the concept of before and after isn't going to apply to God. And that's why we say that God is eternal. So we have, as humans, no experience with the notion of eternality. And that's one reason why a lot of people struggle with it. And they'll maybe say that at one time God was eternal, but since creation at least, he is everlasting. For those that endorse that viewpoint, ultimately they're going to have to swallow, and many of them do, and they're okay with that. Just within classical theism, we're not going to be comfortable with it for a host of reasons. But if we're going to say that God's everlasting, we're going to have to say that in some way God changes, which is going to mean that he's either lost or gained some perfection. And it's that part that brings us to the place that no, he doesn't change. And because of that, because there is no sense in which God has potentiality to change, God exists in what is often referred to as eternal now. Now, again, as we said, for humans, we have now, and then I wait a few seconds, and I have a new now, and then I wait a few more seconds, I have a new now. But for God, there's just now. So that means for God, what took place December 13th in 1050 AD, God experiences that just as he is with right now for us today. And you go back further in history. For God, it is all just now. And this is a very radical conception, but it is an important affirmation to make related to God, as we'll get to the implications for it in our worship here in a few moments. But when we take that God is eternal and we compare that to creatures, we see it's a fundamentally different type of existence. But again, as we said, God is a fundamentally different type of being in the first place. So when we think of God being eternal, that for God there just is now, whether it was when you were 1 year old, whether it's today, whether it's when you're 80 years old, or 7,000 years ago, for God there's just now. When you think about what takes place at every single Holy Eucharist, it's not, as it's often said, that we are redoing Jesus' death on the cross. That's absolutely incorrect. That happened once in human history in either 30 or 33 AD. But because of God's eternal now, every single Mass, every single sacrifice of the Mass is now for God, just like the actual sacrifice on the cross of Calvary was. And so when we see and we frame things from God's perspective, of course, from our human perspective, Jesus died on the cross in 30 or 33 AD, and If you go to Mass Sunday morning at 10 a.m., you have that Mass at that time as from our before or after. But for God, it's just now. And it truly does bring us through our participation in Holy Eucharist to the cross in a most unique manner. And truly, we can say, from God's position of eternity, they are now. Every single one is intimately tied to the cross because of that. And it's what allows us to, in the Mass, truly participate, of course, not in human history, but we can have a level of participation in the sacrifice that took place on the cross of Calvary when Jesus was bodily executed by Roman and Jewish authorities. Of course, the sacrifice of the Mass is different, but there is a genuine way in which we participate in that is most strictly tied to God's eternality. So this doctrine of God being eternal, if God is everlasting, we lose that. And for those that want to embrace God being an everlasting God compared to being an eternal God, we do lose that notion that every single Mass participates in the actual sacrifice of Jesus on the cross in a unique manner, because if God does experience before and afters, we can't say that the now for God would include both Jesus' death at Calvary and any sacrifice of the Mass that's taken place ever since. So again, these classical doctrines truly do matter. Because it's not just maybe frivolous academic speculation, though there, of course, can be time for that. They do make a monumental difference for us practically in how we worship God. Thank you.